a legend that has survived for 700 years, a claim, repeated across generations, that one of the largest tribal societies on Earth descends from soldiers who marched with Alexander the Great, or from a lost tribe of ancient Israel, exiled thousands of miles from home, a population of more than 50 million people, spread across Afghanistan and Pakistan, whose own oral tradition points toward the Mediterranean and the Near East. And now, a body of genetic research, built up study by study over almost 2 decades, that tells a very different story about where the Pathans actually came from. The legend is old, the DNA is newer, and they do not agree. This is not internet folklore. It is a real, published body of population genetics research, running from a landmark 2007 study in the European Journal of Human Genetics through mitochondrial DNA surveys, Y Bostonini duct chromosome analyses, and even a full genome sequence from a single Pathan individual. The core 2007 study, titled Y Chromosomal Evidence for a Limited Greek Contribution to the Pathan Population of Pakistan, was led by researcher Sadaf Firasat, working alongside Shagufta Khalik and Aisha Mohyuddin at the Biomedical and Genetic Engineering Division of Dr. A.Q. Khan Research Laboratories in Islamabad, in collaboration with Myrto Papayawanu at the Center for Thalassemia in Athens, geneticist Chris Tyler Smith of the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute in the UK, and Peter Underhill of Stanford University's Department of Genetics. That is 5 institutions across 3 countries working together on one question: does the Pathan bloodline legend hold up under direct genetic testing? To understand why this question needed real testing in the first place, picture 2 rival family stories passed down for centuries, each one claiming the same starting point but pointing to a different origin. One version says the Pathans descend from Bani Israel, the biblical lost tribes of Israel, a claim that became especially popular in South Asia, starting in the 14th century, and hardened into common belief among certain religious scholars by the 17th century. The other version, older still in some tellings, says the Pathans descend from Greek soldiers who stayed behind in the region after Alexander the Great's campaigns through Central and South Asia between 327 and 323 BC. Both stories share the same basic shape. A foreign army or a displaced people arrives, settles, and becomes the ancestor of a population that today numbers in the tens of millions. Genetics gives researchers a way to actually test a claim like that, the same way a paternity test settles a family dispute, except here the disputed relationship spans 2,500 years instead of 1 generation. Here's the part that makes this testable at all. Every man alive carries a Y chromosome passed down almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, picking up small mutations along the way that act like a slowly ticking clock. Compare that Y chromosome across enough men from 2 different populations, and you can measure how closely related their male lineages actually are, and roughly how long ago those lineages diverged. It works a bit like comparing 2 copies of the same handwritten letter that have been recopied by hand for 2,000 years. Most of the letter stays identical, but small copying errors creep in over time, and if you know roughly how often those errors happen, you can estimate how many generations separate one copy from another. That is essentially what Firasat's team did at a genetic rather than a literary scale, comparing the Y chromosomes of Pathan men directly against a sample of modern Greek men. The scale of the study is the number worth sitting with here, because it separates this from a small pilot project. The researchers typed 90 binary polymorphisms and 16 short tandem repeat markers across 952 men in total, including 77 Greek participants, alongside samples from the Burusho and Kalash populations of northern Pakistan, 2 other groups that carry their own long-standing legends of Greek descent. 952 men. That is not a handful of volunteers. That is a data set large enough to detect a signal even if the true genetic contribution turned out to be small. It's worth pausing on why the Burusho and Kalash were included at all, because it makes the comparison sharper rather than muddier. Both groups live in the same general mountain corridor of northern Pakistan as many Pathan communities, and both have their own version of the Alexander legend attached to their oral history. Including them, let the researchers ask a more precise question than simply, do Pathans have Greek ancestry? It let them ask which of 3 neighboring populations, all telling a similar founding story, actually carried the closest measurable genetic relationship to real modern Greek samples. That kind of built-in comparison group is exactly what separates a rigorous population genetics study from a simple 2-population test, because it gives the researchers a baseline to judge whether any signal they find in the Pathans is genuinely distinctive or just background noise shared across the whole region. And the signal they found was small, but it was real. Earlier, cruder studies going back decades had already ruled out anything close to a large-scale Greek genetic contribution to these populations. What Firasat's team wanted to know was whether a smaller, more limited signal might still be hiding in the data. using genetic distance measurements sensitive to relatively recent events. The lowest distance out of every population comparison in the entire study turned up between the Pathans and the Greeks, closer than the distance between Greeks and the Barusho, and much closer than Greeks and the Kalash. The Kalash, interestingly, turned out to be genetically distinct from all the surrounding groups, a finding consistent with a long history of relative isolation in their Hindu Kush valleys, and one that had already been noted in earlier genetic surveys of the region. Then came the more striking detail. A Y chromosome lineage called clade E3b1, common among Greek men but rare across Pakistan generally, turned up in 2 individual Pathan men in the sample. One of those 2 men carried a YSTR haplotype, essentially a precise genetic fingerprint that matched a haplotype found among the Greek participants almost exactly. Now, here's the part that connects the genetics back to the calendar. Based on the mutation rate of that shared haplotype, the researchers estimated a coalescence age, meaning how long ago the 2 matching lineages likely shared a common ancestor. That lined up with the era of Alexander's campaign through the region between 327 and 323 BC. To be clear about what that means and does not mean, this is one haplotype carried by one individual in the entire dataset, whose statistical age estimate happens to overlap with a specific historical window more than 2,000 years ago. It is not proof that this particular man's ancestor marched in Alexander's army. It is a genetic signature consistent with a small, real, historically timed contribution from a Mediterranean source population sitting inside an overwhelmingly non-Greek genetic background. The paper's own conclusion, published under the title referencing a limited Greek contribution, was written that precisely on purpose. Strong evidence for a European origin, but only for a small proportion of Pathan Y chromosomes, not the population as a whole. Quick recap before we go further, because this is where the story usually gets flattened online into something simpler than it actually is. A large multi-institution genetic study compared Pathan Y chromosomes directly against Greek samples. It found the closest genetic distance of any group tested, plus a handful of individual lineages carrying a real, datable European signature. But it also confirmed, using the same dataset, that this signature accounts for only a small fraction of the total Pathan gene pool, not the population's overall ancestry. That leaves one obvious question hanging in the air. If Greek ancestry only explains a sliver of the picture, where does the rest of the Pathan genetic story actually come from? That is exactly where the research turns next, and it turns toward a completely different rival legend. In the next part of this, we go straight into the mitochondrial DNA. This is where the second major legend, the Bani Israel claim, runs into direct genetic testing. A separate study analyzed complete mitochondrial control region data from 230 unrelated Pathan individuals from the Northwest Frontier Province and the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, tracing the maternal line, the DNA passed down from mother to child, largely unchanged across generations. The picture that emerged was, in the researchers' own framing, heterogeneous, a population carrying a high percentage of West Eurasian mitochondrial haplogroups, followed by haplogroups more typical of South Asia, and a smaller fraction tracing to East Asian lineages. That is a maternal lineage profile built from deep regional roots across West and South. Asia, layered together over a very long time span, not a single recent migration from one specific place. That raises a second question, and it's the one that gets to the heart of the Bani Israel claim specifically. If Pathan ancestry were substantially Israelite, deriving from a Near Eastern population that migrated east roughly 2,500 years ago, you would expect to see a matching genetic footprint, something comparable to the Y chromosome signatures researchers used to study other diaspora populations with genuinely documented Near Eastern origins. On the paternal side, the dominant lineage across both Afghan and Pakistani Pathan populations turns out to be haplogroup R1A1A, found in more than half of men sampled in some regional studies, a lineage strongly associated with Indo-Iranian and wider Indo-European speaking populations, stretching from South Asia through Central Asia. For comparison, R1A1A shows up in Ashkenazi Jewish populations at a frequency of roughly 15%, a meaningful presence, but nowhere near the majority signal found in Pathan men. That contrast matters, because it means the dominant Pathan paternal lineage points toward the same broad Indo-Iranian genetic family found across much of South and Central Asia, rather than toward a distinct Near Eastern founder population, arriving as a single historical wave. It's worth being precise about what that R1A1A majority actually tells us, because a single dominant lineage is not the same thing as an entire ancestry. R1A1A is not unique to Pathans. It is shared, at varying frequencies, across a huge stretch of Eurasia, from parts of Eastern Europe through Central Asia and into North India, generally linked to the spread of Indo-European languages and the populations that carried them thousands of years ago. Finding that lineage dominant in Pathan men does not point to one single tidy point of origin, any more than finding a common surname across an entire region would identify one specific founding family. What it does is place Pathan paternal ancestry firmly inside the same broad genetic and linguistic family as their neighbors across Afghanistan, Pakistan, and much of northern India. A family with deep and complicated roots stretching back long before any Greek army or any Israelite migration would have arrived. There's also a question worth sitting with here about what population level data can and cannot prove. No researcher has ever claimed to have found and tested the DNA of Qais Abdur Rashid, the semi-legendary figure Pathan oral tradition identifies as the founding patriarch of the entire people, traditionally placed sometime around the 11th century AD. There is no tomb, no preserved remains, no individual sample connecting any living. Pathan directly back to a single founding ancestor, the way, say, researchers have occasionally traced specific royal remains through targeted testing. What exists instead is population-level evidence drawn from hundreds of living individuals, and that is a meaningfully different kind of proof than testing one named historical person. Population genetics can tell you what the ancestral makeup of a group looks like in broad strokes. It can rule large-scale claims in or out with real statistical confidence. It cannot verify or falsify a single founding figure's identity, because that specific man's remains have never been available for testing in the first place. This is where a third piece of evidence adds real depth to the picture, and it comes from a different kind of study entirely, one that shows how far this field has moved since the original 2007 paper. Where the earlier studies worked from a few dozen targeted genetic markers across hundreds of people, this next project took the opposite approach, reading the complete genetic code of a single person, letter by letter, and comparing that entire genome against reference populations from across the continent. In 2015, researchers published the first whole genome sequence of a single ethnic Pathan individual from northwest Pakistan, comparing it against the Human Genome Diversity Project's Central Asian population panels, using roughly 650,000 genetic markers. That individual's mitochondrial haplogroup, H2, and Y chromosome haplogroup, L1, both match patterns typical of the broader region. But the more revealing part of that study came from a technique called PSMC, a method that reconstructs a population's historical size over time using patterns hidden inside a single genome. It showed a relatively recent increase in effective population size, consistent with an extended history of admixture between European and Asian lineages in exactly the geographic corridor where the Pathan homeland sits. That single genome does not replace population scale sampling, but it independently reinforces the same broader conclusion. The earlier Y chromosome and mitochondrial studies had already pointed toward a population built from deep, layered Eurasian ancestry, accumulated over a long span of time, not a sudden replacement by one outside group. So, by the time you line up all three lines of evidence, the Y chromosome study, the mitochondrial survey, and the single whole genome, a consistent picture starts to take shape. The dominant genetic story of the Pathans is Indo-Iranian and broadly Central South Asian, layered and blended across a very long time frame. The same deep regional ancestry shared with neighboring populations across the wider Hindu Kush and Indus region. Sitting on top of that dominant signal is a small, real, statistically detectable trace of Mediterranean ancestry, concentrated in specific lineages, datable to roughly the right historical window, but never amounting to anything close to a population. Defining origin. Both legends, in other words, are pointing at something. Neither legend is the whole story the genetics actually tells. It's also worth stepping back and asking why these two particular legends, out of all the possible origin stories that people could tell about themselves, took hold so firmly in the first place. Historians who study the spread of the Bani Israel claim point out that it became especially widespread in South Asia starting in the 14th century, often promoted by religious scholars working from genealogical traditions rather than direct evidence, and it continued to circulate for centuries afterward, simply because it offered a compelling connection to a well-known biblical narrative. The Greek soldier legend has a similarly long history, tied to the simple fact that Alexander's armies genuinely did pass directly through this exact region on their way toward India, leaving behind garrisons and, in some historical accounts, wounded or unwilling soldiers who never made the journey home. Both legends, in other words, latch onto something historically real, a documented migration path and a documented military campaign, even if the genetic evidence shows neither one produced anything close to a population founding event. That is often how origin legends survive. Not by being entirely invented, but by taking a real historical thread and stretching it far beyond what it can actually support. Now, to be clear about where the science stands and where it doesn't, because this is exactly the kind of topic we're confident. Sounding claims spread faster online than careful ones. What has genuinely been established across multiple independent peer-reviewed studies using different genetic markers and different research teams is that Pathan ancestry is overwhelmingly Indo-Iranian and West to South Asian in character, and that any Greek genetic contribution, while real and measurable in specific lineages, is limited rather than population defining. What has not been established, and what no legitimate genetic study has claimed, is a direct test of any specific named historical figure, whether that's Qais Abdur-Rashid or any individual soldier from Alexander's army. This is population-level evidence built from hundreds of living participants, not individual, level proof connecting any single ancestor across 2,000 years. It's also worth being honest that the sample sizes here, while substantial for population genetics, still represent specific regional groups within a much larger and more geographically spread population. And later, larger-scale genomic studies may refine these percentages further as sequencing technology continues to improve. There's a related caveat worth naming plainly because it applies to almost every study cited here. Every one of these projects sampled specific Pathan communities from specific regions, largely within Pakistan's former Northwest Frontier Province, the federally administered tribal areas, and comparable populations in Afghanistan. Pathan identity spans an enormous geographic and tribal range, from the Durrani and Ghilzai confederations of Afghanistan to dozens of smaller tribal groupings spread across 2 countries, and genetic diversity within a population. This large is rarely uniform from one region or tribe to the next. A finding drawn from several hundred participants in one part of that range is genuinely informative, and consistent results across multiple independent studies using different genetic markers make the overall pattern more trustworthy, not less. But it is still a sampled picture of a very large and internally diverse population, not an exhaustive census of every Pathan lineage, everywhere. And researchers in this field have generally been careful to frame their conclusions that way, rather than overstating them. And that gap between the 2 kinds of evidence is really the whole point of this story. A legend does not need a coalescence date or a haplogroup frequency to matter to the people who carry it forward. A genetic study does not set out to erase an identity. It sets out to answer one narrow, testable question about ancestry, using tools that simply did not exist for most of the centuries these stories have been told. Neither one cancels the other out. They are just answering different questions, using different kinds of evidence, on very different timescales. So the legend and the genome end up telling 2 different kinds of truth. The legend preserves identity, memory, and a story that people have told about themselves for centuries. The kind of narrative that shapes how a culture understands its own place in history. The genome preserves something else entirely, an unbroken chemical record, copied imperfectly from parent to child for thousands of years, indifferent to which version of the story anyone wanted to believe. They do not have to agree to both be meaningful. What the DNA actually shows is a population deeply rooted in the soil of Central and South Asia, carrying in a small number of lineages a faint, real, and genuinely fascinating echo of a much more distant encounter. So tell me in the comments which detail changed your view more: the discovery that a real, datable Greek genetic signature does exist in a handful of Pathan lineages, or the fact that the dominant ancestral story, tested across mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome data, and a full genome, points toward Central and South Asia all along.